Welcome, everyone, to our 5 Years Out panel from the Instructional Development Division. If you notice in the program, or at least in my program, 5 Years Out is left out in the title. It just says, in the Instructional Development Division, it's always something. And I'm not sure that was probably the best title without the 5 years out. And the reason I came up with that title originally, if some of you may recall, is when we decided to participate in this last year, I sent an email message to all members of IDD and just asked for some suggestions on what possibly we could discuss. And I got a million different responses. And it just reminded me of the Gilda Radner character, Rosanna Dana. If you remember that, and she said, it's always something. If it's not one thing, it's another, blah, 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 blah. And that's kind of where the responses came from. You know, I got a lot of cognitive learning needs to be discussed, and then I got some really just across-the-board type of responses. And I was a little testy toward the end. And I thought, well, we'll just call It's Always Something, because actually, if you've been a member of this group for a while, it really is always something. But on that note, what we decided to do was essentially look at the evolution of our division. And so the way we're going to run this afternoon is we're going to have our panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment, discuss briefly, representing three time periods or three areas of emphasis, I'm going to call it, in our division. They're going to discuss just briefly what happened during that time period, because we don't necessarily have all the background from IDD, and we need to think about where we're going to go. And then from that point forward, we're going to ask a couple of questions in which the panelists are all going to be free to contribute and provide their responses to those questions. And as we get closer to the end, if time permits, then we can also, of course, take some questions from the audience. But first, I want to just introduce who our panelists are, and I do appreciate all of you agreeing to serve on this. I know it's one more duty, and I was real pleased to be able to put this group together. Where I'm going to work left to right, so you can recognize these individuals. Our first panelist is Kathleen Galvin from Northwestern University. Our second, Mary Bozick, who is recently retired from the University of Northern Iowa. Melissa Beal, who is not recently retired from the University of Northern Iowa. Jim McCroskey, who, when he retires, goes and finds another job. He's at the University of Alabama. Ann Freimeyer from Miami University. Tim Mote from the University of Texas Pan American. Ann Darling from the University of Utah. Deanna Fassett from San Jose State University. And John Warren from Southern Illinois University. So this is our panel, and we look forward to hearing your responses. So we're going to start briefly, as I had mentioned, with just a brief evolution or some sort of a timeline of where we've gone, where we are, and where we maybe should hope to be. And so we're going to start with we're going to call it our speech education gang. This would be Kathy, Mary, and Melissa, and then we'll just let Ann, Tim, and Jim pick up from there, and then we'll move to Ann, Deanna, and John without any interruption from me. Kathy?
I'm going to start actually in the beginning, which is really 1915, and basically James O'Neill, president of the National Association of Academic Teachers of Public Speaking, in 1915, and that's our organization now, it said, non-academic and extracurricular triumphs and victories must not be the most prized distinctions. The platform and the stage must give way to the study and the classroom as the source of our best and most important work and our richest and most enduring rewards. When I came to Northwestern University as a graduate student, it was speech education. It wasn't even communication education, it was speech education. And the major mission at that point was the preparation of elementary and secondary speech teachers. And there was a market for such people in that particular era. And so I came as a graduate student. I just refused to leave my office, so I hung out for the next 40 years or so. And in that era then, the goal was to prepare competent speech teachers. And we had a number of methods courses, a series of methods courses that students took. We did all the certification. My first number of years on the faculty were spent heavily in all the local, in my case, high schools, observing student teachers, whatever. So it started out at many schools in that particular era as speech education, and the sole focus was really the preparation of certified K through 12 teachers.
Well, and I'm a good bridge to that because at the University of Northern Iowa, I was a ComEd person. And I did both basic course directing and preparing of the speech teachers. And then that job became too big when the basic course was required for everybody at the university. And so Melissa came and took over that half of my job, and I went with just the speech teacher program. And I think there's a strong connection between those two in terms of preparing instructors at all levels, kindergarten, high school, community college, and graduate teaching. So that's kind of my background in this. One of the things that I want to just briefly talk about is that impressed me when I joined NCA in 1982 was that IDD at that time was a real player. It was one of the largest and one of the most powerful, at least that was my perception at the time. And when you look at the leadership from 1982 to this day, there are just incredible number of instructional development folks who have taken on leadership roles in this organization. And I think that's one of the things about this division's past, present, and future that is really quite remarkable, I think.
And I came out of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and was a product of a speech teacher education program. I enjoyed it so much, and I had many faculty members who told me, you will give back to the profession. You will serve in the profession. So at the time, Dr. Leroy Lossy had been our department head for many years, and he kept after me, if you are a teacher out in the schools, you must go to the regional and national and state and other organizations. So I took that very literally. I became very involved. As an undergraduate, I was involved in going to the conventions. And I found that when I came to NCA, which was at that time SCA, people looked at my name tag and they said, high school teacher, what are you doing here? Well, at first I came as a student, and that was kind of unusual in those days too. That tells you how old I am. But to be a teacher here was really, I felt I have to become even more involved so that I can let people know that we have ideas and that we're the ones sending people to the programs. And so this was a natural place for me to be. And we went from speech education to communication education somewhere in those years as our name. And I agree with everything that Kathy and Mary have said, but not only a lot of the leadership has come from this division, but a lot of the ideas. When I served as chair of the Ed Policies Commission, Board, Ed Policies Board, I was the first K-12 teacher to serve as the chair of that for a 3-year period. And I felt that was vindication for my faculty colleagues and mentors, but also for the K-12 teachers, that I was able to get into that position. Not necessarily my own strengths, but because of the strength of IDD and basic course and some of the other things. So we have played a significant role, and I think we'll continue to do so.
And just one last point, the biggest name in that era was a name of Carl Robinson, who wrote the first methods textbook and was a renowned professor at Northwestern at the time, and I was fortunate enough to study with him for 1 year before he left. But the name Carl Robinson is very much synonymous with the founder of what is now a totally different type of organization.
Sure.
Oh.
It's your turn.
It's my turn.
Handing it to you. Instructional.
Okay.
Not that you need it.
Yeah, you probably can hear me, right? Can you still hear me? Well, I've looked forward to teaching when I was in high school. Decided I wanted to be a teacher. Of course, I wanted to be a coach also. when you're male, that's the kind of stupidity that you look forward for. And when I graduated from Southern State Teachers College, I'm sure you've all heard of it. It doesn't exist anymore. Now, then I went to teaching, high school, and I got then to what my debate tournament. My debate teams were very successful. Won national championship. I got a better job. It's it's just the way that you move up in the debate world. You win. So I won one tournament the first year, and we had the state tournament that was the Class B. So I got a job for the next 2 years, Class A. Won that tournament, and then went to Hawaii, and that was my first out of high school, if you will, teaching. I was teaching public speaking, obviously, like everybody else, but I was in Hawaii, and I decided the best thing for me to do is to get out of here as fast as I can go. And my mentor agreed with me, said I need to go back and get a doctorate. I picked up a master's in between while I was teaching and coaching. And so that's exactly what I did, and went to Penn State. And all I mentioned, always wanted to be a teacher. Well, I wasn't really happy being a debate coach. I looked in the future and said, there is no future for this, which turns out for most people. So I decided that I wanted to get a doctorate. I went to Penn State. Best decision I ever made in my life, because I had two options. One, I could learn 2 languages, or 2, that you could work with the education department and take 15 hours of research methods. Gee, what punishment. Well, at any rate, I had some of the normal graduate stuff in education, but I'd had an education major and then in a minor when I was in my second operation. Then getting that real degree. And where do you go from there? Well, I went to Michigan State. One of the best moves I ever made, because they were people that were really out there. They were interested in real research, quantitative research. In fact, they didn't think anything else should be called research, and I found that to be very pleasant. And they fellow by the name of Burlow. Have you ever remembered that name? One of the biggest jerks I've ever met, and the best person I ever worked for. I didn't love him, but boy, he was good to me. And one of the things that he did was to teach me how to stand up and teach a large class. I never taught anything more than 25. He gave me 350. I said, how do you do this? He said, you'll figure it out. So I managed to do that, got through the first 3 years there, got a new job at Illinois State, more money. And there I was directed to be the basic course director and the director of the graduate program. And number one thing I was supposed to do is get a PhD program. I won't go into that, but just let's put it, say they still don't have one. I was then in a different kind of teaching, where you were getting people getting master's degrees, and with the idea that when they got done with that, they were going to get go for the big degree, right? Well, that didn't work out that way, right? But I had learned how to get a large group of people who wanted to be graduate students and be teachers, and that worked out quite well. All I did was every coach that I knew in the United States, I got on the phone and said, "You got any students that would like to get a graduate program? And what's their grade point like?" And we went from 4 graduate assistants to 36. And the idea was every one of those people was going to be taught so that they would go through to a graduate program and succeed. All but 2 did. And a lot of that became because I had had those different instructional processes. I moved from there, as everybody knows, to West Virginia. I was told that there's 3 things you got to do: get a graduate program going, get some students. We had a required public speaking class. I abolished it, got 4 times as many students in the program. Now we put some back in. I think you've got public speaking classes now, don't you? Yeah. We didn't for a while. So all communication was not public speaking, and all of the improvements, if you will, really made it nice. And the third thing he told me I had to do was some outreach. So I said, here's an opportunity. I get to teach teachers. Within the next 30 years, we served approximately 200,000 people that got graduate degrees in communication and instruction. And that program's still going, as I understand it. And why do I tell all of these things? Because it all came to the point we went out and made a program, a research-based program for teachers in communication. You know how many of those there were in the United States at that time? None. There were a few people that taught some classes, but had no program. So ours was the first program, and essentially this operation was created by the people who taught or got master's degree from West Virginia. A lot of people probably don't even know that, but certainly you know it from down there. But we taught more teachers than there were teachers in the state of West Virginia. And we had a lot of teachers from around the edges also that came into the programs. And so if we got all of our graduates of that program here, we would probably have more people in the building than we have in this organization. Now, how does that program work? You can talk about that later.
On to me? When I came to West Virginia to study for my doctorate in 1989 and was introduced to instructional communication really then and again studying it, there was a lot of people still in their own discipline who really questioned a lot of the things that we studied and a lot of the things we did. And one of the first things I studied as instructional was affinity seeking, and how the things teachers do that facilitate students liking them. And on more than one occasion, communication professors, not outside our discipline, but within the discipline, questioned me publicly, why should we get students to like us? That whole idea of affective learning, which I think has really become much more acceptable throughout, not just in instructional, but throughout the communication discipline, really wasn't very accepted then. And the teaching was about developing cognitive learning, and that whole affect thing was kind of trivial or fuzzy and really wasn't very important.
But we persevered, as Jim often is well known for doing, is persevering, and we developed slowly with many people, not just at West Virginia, but other scholars as well, and built on that and gradually developed evidence that, what teachers do in the classroom influences student learning, not what they do in terms of content presentation. I mean, that's important too, but developing the affect and better understanding. And so instructional communication evolved from that, how to teach speech and how to teach people to teach speech, to instructional of looking at those broader questions of how do students learn, and how does our communication across the discipline impact them. And I think one of the key things that happened in that transition from comm ed to instructional communication was in the 80s when the Plax, Carney, Richmond McCroskey team developed the first cognitive learning measure. But the biggest thing was that methodology of asking students to report on that teacher preceding their comm class, because it was that advancement in our methodology when instructional communication research really took off. That's when we really started being able to draw conclusions and really began to be able to understand what's going on in the classroom. Because prior to that, we just had students report on the teacher they had in that class, which really minimized the amount of variance. We basically were studying communication teachers, and we didn't really know what was going on in the other classrooms. And so that advancement in the 80s was really, I think, a transformational moment for instructional communication when that methodology came through. So, Tim, I'll let you go from there.
Jim was talking about the best decision that he ever made was to go into Penn State, and the best decision I ever made was going to West Virginia University and working with Dr. McCroskey and all the other colleagues at West Virginia. I worked in industry for 10 years as an operations manager for an airline, and I had done a lot of work in training and development. And in the mid-'90s, I decided it was time for me to go back to grad school. And so I found the West Virginia program, and I was interested in blending kind of training experiences, adult education, communication, my first love, and looking for a program that kind of blended those two areas. And all paths at that point led to West Virginia. So I became a part of what is known as the West Virginia model, and I just wanted to just kind of articulate some of what that model was at the time. The focus was on communication variables, and if we were not focusing on communication messages, we heard from Dr. McCroskey that it wasn't communication. So there was always a focus on what is the message, what are the variables, and are the variables communication. So there was a real strict kind of a discipline on making sure that we were studying message variables. The model was quantitative. A lot of our survey methodology at that time was primarily survey research. And we also learned about programmatic research, as Ann was talking about, the idea of taking a larger idea and looking at it from multiple perspectives, or tying one study to another study, and to making it more programmatic for hopefully developing some type of theory. The focus was also on traits at that time. There was a heavy emphasis on incorporating traits into the model, and are traits predictive? Are teacher traits, are student traits predictive of a variety of different outcomes? And then there was the other beauty of the West Virginia model was in the summers, Dr. McCroskey would always employ us. We went to remote outposts in West Virginia, working with a variety of teachers, and he told us, when you teach educators, they can be a tough group. Teachers are, K through 12th grade teachers they're pretty tough as an audience. And many of us we'd never been a teacher before. And he said, you have to be better than the best teacher in the room. And in this class, he or she he always knew who the best teacher was in that room. So when you walked in, you knew you had to be better than that particular person. So there was a lot of preparation. You always wanted to try to be better than the best teacher. So that still remains with me. But I think that I hope kind of summarizes some of the West Virginia model at that time when I was fortunate to be a student there.
So I want to thank, on the record, Don Braithwaite for coming up with these ideas, because these 5-year out panels, because I think that they're going to be a wonderful resource for ourselves and for generations to come. And I'm so honored to be on this panel with the people that have spoken before me. I'm an accidental communication major. I was a teacher ed major. I was going to major in theater. I wanted to teach theater. That's all I wanted to do. I wanted to take no other courses besides theater courses and teaching theater. But you had to take electives at the University of New Mexico at the time. And my father was a dean. And he said, you have to take a course from Lawrence Rosenfeld. You just have to. And at the time, to add courses, you had to stand in line in the New Mexico sun. And Lawrence Rosenfeld's line was the longest line. And I stood in line because my father said to, and I'm a daddy's girl, and I always do what he says. And I stood in line, and I took Lawrence Rosenfeld's course, and the rest is history. I changed my major. I became a speech teacher. I read methods books by the people in this room, not only the people at this panel, but the people in the audience, Gus Friedrich, Cass Book, Arlie Daniel. So I first was one of your people. I was a speech teacher. I taught speech in the high school for 3 years. And then I decided that I needed to go forward, and I went back to graduate school at the University of New Mexico. And by that time, Gene Civicli, who had guided me through my teacher ed program at the University of New Mexico, was well developed in the University of New Mexico, and so she was clearly an instructional scholar, working with worked with Kibler. And so I, of course, became an instructional scholar because that's what Gene did. And so Gene coached me and finished my master's thesis there. And in that process, I read Jody Nyquist and Don Wolfe and Ann Staton. And I said, well, there's one place to go for me, with all due respect. There was one place for me to go for my PhD, and that was the University of Washington, and that's the best decision that I ever made. So at the University of Washington, I studied with Ann Staton. When I asked her to be my advisor, she said, let's see if I can get the Southern accent. It's been so long, I don't think I can get it anymore. Are you sure? And I said, yes, I'm sure. I came here for that. And so I studied with Jody and Ann, and that's when I was introduced to Joe Sprague. My dissertation was on teacher socialization, working with Ann Staton. But in the process of reading for that dissertation, I came across people like Henry Giroux, Peter McLaren, Bob Tabachnik at the University of Wisconsin. And they have a very critical take on socialization. And those of you in the room who know Ann Staton know that Ann Staton does not take a critical approach. And if you want to get your dissertation done quickly, I see my graduate student in the room, you do what your dissertation advisor says. And so I did. And I put those critical questions, which I found to be very provocative, in the back of my brain for several years. And then Joe Sprague published 2 articles that invited us all to become more critical and to explore communication through that critical lens and ask questions about equity, access, fairness, and justice. And that's where I am today. So, because of these 2 folks that you're going to hear from now.
It's interesting sitting here. I feel like I can hear some parallels that I didn't expect. I'm incredibly honored to be here on a panel with so many established members of our discipline and people whose work I've read and responded to in my own published work. And it's a kind of a wonderful and blessed place to be, in a sense. I had a very different kind of accidental experience with coming into this part of our discipline, in the sense that whenever I went to Southern Illinois University for my PhD, at that very moment, all of our instructional comm folks hit the chutes for various reasons, and I found myself working with people who were interested in better understanding the classroom and understanding research about how to improve teaching in and out of our discipline, but most of them were not classically trained. And so my primary areas of expertise were trying to take philosophy of comm and take it into the classroom, or think about the classroom in new ways, or to take performance studies coursework and try to help that enrich my understanding of the classroom and research on the intersections of communication and instruction. And so it was a fun way to get started. And I found myself, as a result, like Jim, going to another department on campus. I went out to the School of Education, only I took courses in social foundations of education. So philosophy of education, anthropology of education, sociology of education. And there I encountered work by Paulo Freire, Henry Giroux, some of the people that you've heard Anne mention. And I became very interested in the classroom as a space for social justice and change, and a very intentional space for those activities to occur. And so I began to look for that in my own field. And while, I think John and Ann and I are very happy to be up here, I think we'll all recognize, as Ann suggested, that there were people doing this work long before John and I ever wrote a book about critical communication pedagogy. Probably the most significant person we look to is Jo Sprague, again, and it'd be fun to get her up here, but I know she would rather just sit there and enjoy. But it's one of those things where there were other people ahead of us, not just in instructional communication or communication education, but because I had an unconventional preparation, I was finding this work in performance studies, in TPQ, in other aspects of our field, critical intercultural communication, for instance, Rona Hululani and Tom Nakayama and some of these folks. And their work has been integral to how we've developed. And our book has, in a sense, was an effort on our part to make a space and a prism and a launch pad and whatever metaphor you want to use for other people to take up that work and envision possible futures and ways to do work in our field at the intersections of communication and instruction that is multi-theoretical, multi-paradigmatic, multi-method in some really rich and innovative ways. And I'm very thankful that all of those folks had gone on to other careers and other institutions, because it gave me an insight into the discipline that I might not have had otherwise.
Hi. I actually began as an undergrad at Indiana State University, and I was fortunate enough to have Darlene Hansis and Sherry Daly and Sue Davis, which are 3 performance studies faculty members who were at Indiana State doing the oral interpretation program. And that was kind of how I always kind of saw myself being in the world, was as a performance studies scholar. And I really didn't pay much attention to education or anything having to do with instruction. And then when I took one of the classes with Darlene Hansis, I was introduced to some of this work on research and critical pedagogy, and I really became kind of invested in that, enough so that I joined the General Education and Action Committee on our campus, which was about bringing liberal arts to the world, and so we were programming that on our campus. And so I went to a festival in which I met Elise Pineau at Southern Illinois University, and that's when I was introduced to performative pedagogy, and that became kind of my entry into the study of the classroom. And so I did my master's and PhD at Southern Illinois University, and that was kind of my foundation. And so I found things like ethnography and critical ethnography and performance ethnography, studying cultural studies as it might apply to the classroom. And so my dissertation was a critical ethnography of a classroom, looking at how whiteness gets constituted by the subjects of those classrooms. And so that became kind of my lens and my entry point into really thinking about myself. At least in some kind of context that would put me up here at this table. And so I'm really owe a huge debt to those folks. And so performative pedagogy really becomes kind of my linchpin, and so the work that Deanna and I have been able to do has really allowed us to kind of move that line between critical and performative in some really interesting and evocative ways for me. One of the things that I kind of want to get to the discussion, so I just want to kind of end by saying thank you to Scott for, first of all, having me on the panel and allowing for this point of view to be available for us, and then also to thank him for being a section editor on the new Sage Handbook of Communication and Instruction, which I want to advertise, coming out in March. And Darlene was another section editor, as was Deanna and I, and so I would encourage people to get this. This is one view of how the field might look. So
in all paradigmatic respects.
In all paradigmatic respects, absolutely. So with that, I think we should have a conversation.
Okay, well, thank you for, I'm going to say, a brief history of how IDD has come to be. And actually, as I was listening to our 9 panelists, I was also just reflecting on my own education and visualizing how we moved from speech ed into instructional communication, with the notion that the critical communication is something that we really should start to perhaps pay more attention to. At this time, what I would like to do now is to open it up to our panelists and have them identify what they consider to be Instructional Development Division's significant contributions to teaching and research. And I'm hoping that I'm hoping we hear something really interesting, and I know we will. I didn't mean it like that. What I meant was, I'm thinking of my own stuff. I'm interested in hearing what you have to say because I have my own idea, of course, as someone who researches and teaches instructional development. And I'm curious to hear what the 9 of you would like to share with us. And we can open it up to whoever would like to start and just have a discussion among the 9 of you.
Significant contributions that have been made or that should be made in the next 5 years?
I think we'll start with what's been made, and then we'll move into the future shortly. But what contributions have we made collectively as a division to teaching and research? And this is from your perspective in terms of how you teach and how you research.
Well, for me, one of the lines of the programs of research that I use all the time is the immediacy research. I use that when we work with teachers across campus. I use it when we're working within colleges to talk about communication and instruction. My engineering colleagues, when I go in there and try to help my engineering colleagues become better teachers, and I introduce the concept of immediacy, it's their favorite. They love then telling each other about this concept called immediacy that they learned from Ann Darling. So, and it's a very tight, nicely done program of research that has been very, very useful in a variety of contexts and in a variety of ways. And I just think that that's, for me, what I would point to.
I'd like to add to that. One of the things that I've been pretty thankful for, even as I've challenged it, is the study into power in the classroom, particularly. And without that, I don't know what research I would have undertaken, but that for me has been a really important focal point for understanding what happens in the classroom. And for me, the more understandings of power that we take into consideration, the more exciting that study becomes, because we're not just learning about classroom management, though that's significant. We're also looking at the classroom, in a sense, as a microcosm of society and the ways in which we might think about power in a broader sense. So I'm particularly grateful to that work, and I think it's a significant contribution.
I think one of the other areas is the role of technology in education. Folks from this division have done work with distance learning as it has evolved to the current status, and other ways that we interact using everything from PowerPoint to a more sophisticated web-based instructional programs, et cetera. So I think that that's been helpful not only to a communication discipline, but to others out there looking to ways to help communicate in the classroom through technology.
Next question.
I would like to hear from all 9 of you.
All 9?
And it can be rather impromptu. We're not looking for a definitive answer, but based on your experience and based on your own background.
Well, I guess for myself, one of the things I learned throughout the process that redefining the Harvard's on immediacy and power, and a lot of the research really, to me, redefined the teacher-student relationship. My view of what my role as a student was, and then correspondingly when I started teaching, what my role as a teacher was, has really changed and evolved as a result of a lot of the research. Traditionally, and still most people, or other than communication professors, don't view the teacher-student as a relationship that has, you're just on two different sides it's viewed. And I say that I think the research has really redefined that.
I think the research brings us all together. Even though we started as speech ed, comm ed, and then instructional, I would never consider myself a critical scholar, and yet there's a lot of the critical perspective that comes out in my teaching. There's a lot of the instructional that comes out of my teaching, but I still have to go back to my background. So I think what we've done is capitalize within the discipline on the research that's taken place because of people in this division. So we've made significant contributions just because of the way we're looking at things. You know, when I first started teaching, it was lecture, you know, and I didn't do it that way. You know, I wanted interaction. I got written up by one of my department heads as a high school teacher because I had too much discussion in class.
It was noisy, probably, right?
It was noisy. Well, I was 2 doors down from the principal, so that, you know, that made a difference too. But, you know, I just think that I know that coming to conventions here and coming to this division in the meetings and finding out what kinds of things were going on gave me more courage. Not that I really needed a whole lot because I was going to do it anyway or else. You know, figured if I can't do it the way I want to do it, I won't stay in teaching. But, you know, it gave me more courage to pursue it and then to bring up the research that was there. So
I think one of our greatest contributions is the idea that I've been to a lot of teaching and learning types of development opportunities on the campus. And it seems that we always kind of skirt the idea of teaching and learning. We never really get to what is teaching and what is learning. We talk a lot about the administration of teaching, and I've always been amazed that, I don't know, we never really want to talk about the process of teaching. And so I believe for those of us who've been schooled in instructional communication, what we bring to the table is we bring to the table a vocabulary that we introduce that allows other people to think about teaching and learning differently. And once I introduce some of the terms, the vocabulary, it automatically begins a discussion. And if you're not careful, you're immediately tapped by administrators, as some of these folks in this room are, especially up here, to lead large initiatives on campus in terms of graduate teaching assistant education and working with faculty development on campuses. And so whenever I go to a faculty development workshop, I always try to bring up and start talking about teaching and learning from a communication perspective. And it's always welcomed. They are very hungry for the language and for the vocabulary. And I think without the Instructional Development Division, those conversations would not be where they are. So I think our contribution is what we take back to our campuses and enhance teaching in higher education.
I am sort of a visiting immigrant today because in the late 1970s and 1980s at Northwestern, we were, as a private institution, we were no longer turning out the numbers of students that really the school thought needed to be turned out in speech education to justify the program. And in many cases, the few students we were teaching at that point, because many parents didn't want to pay for the private education to become a high school teacher, did not become high school teachers. So that program was beginning to diminish. At the time, I also had become quite fascinated by the growing area of family communication. And the linkage, my initial linkage, was actually marital and family enrichment programs, in which I took the instructional piece that I had and started to learn about and teach and work in marital and family communication programs for people in the communities and whatever, which eventually has evolved to, you know, my really moving very much into that particular area.
Biggest contribution.
Well, I think probably the contribution that we are going to be doing in the future is more important than what we did, because what did we do? We did the best we could and got lucky as heck. When we found out things, when we found out the number one comment that teachers put on a course evaluation form in our off-campus program, over 80% of those people that had a comment had the same comment. And that was, why did I not learn this when I was, again, teacher education? And it was just very clear. What they got was what was important to them in being an effective teacher, which was my goal and everybody's goal that touched that area. And a lot of the people that have done research and are still functioning But now there's new views coming in, and I think that's healthy. I think trying to deal with culture and communication is not easy. Because when we think about culture and communication, what culture? There's only a few million of them, and every one of them is going to claim it's different than another one. And how does that impact a teaching situation? A lot of people have said, "I don't know what the heck to do with this." How do you deal with people that you can't even understand when they talk? I don't have an answer for that. I hope somebody has an answer for it, or some people work on an answer toward this. We pretty much nowadays know what a good teacher is and how to do it, but we don't know the new things, the new problems, the new issues that are definitely coming down the pike at some point. What we do know now, we know is very effective. We teach those teachers that maybe only one class, and at WVU we did a whole program. They got a master's degree. But one class can change their lifestyle. If it's the basic class, they're going to realize that there is something other than the bad advice that they get in education programs. And I do not want to be known as a person who hates the education department. They do their best, but their best isn't good enough because they do not have communication as an element in their instruction. And why? Good question. When I asked for permission at WVU to offer one class for teachers, the provost said, "You sure as hell can." And the dean of education said, yes. Well, it turned out they both had a background at Michigan State and had one degree or another, and they were familiar with education. And they said, "Well, yeah, we'd love to have that." I said, "Well, why don't you hire people to do that?" Well, these people don't know how to teach. Right? Talking about the education people, and he's the education dean, they don't know anything about it. They don't know anything about communication, so they can't teach it. And so that's the way things kind of opened up. And one of the things that I encourage people, if you want to expand your program in your department, go over to the education department and try to make friends, and tell them how wonderful they are. All the good communication stuff, right? And then suggest, have you heard about this such and such, right? Whatever you want. They will not have heard about it, most likely. Odds are pretty good that they'll lie and say, "Oh yes, I know about that." But if you can get them to understand something like homophily, right? That's something when you learn it, you remember it, don't you? Right? And some communication items. Sometimes this will help you get more support from your colleagues in the institution, but also they may feel that it would be good if their students got some communication. And we see that when you have a good teacher, you go in there, you teach them about communication. Those students very often go to whatever level it takes in order to get a communication course. Right? And we do not need to look like the old speech department. What was the old speech department? Well, everybody had to take it and everybody hated it. And the people who really weren't very good were given those classes to teach, and nobody felt very bad about that. And I think those days are over. If they aren't everywhere, they're over most places. And so I think that the future is ripe. This is not, we're not anywhere near the end. We're just at the beginning.
I want to be very brief and just kind of note that there's one piece that really, I think, in the long trajectory of this division in our journal that really stands out to me as kind of a pivotal piece for me, and it's not surprising that it was written from my point of view by Jo Sprague, and it was her ontology piece, Why We Can't All Just Agree to Disagree About Power. I can't remember the entire title, but the reason that piece was so pivotal for me in particular is because it put on the table the question of what is communication, what are we talking about when we talk about communication, and why aren't we asking questions, or what are the different types of questions that we can ask that matter? And so for me, it put on the table what are the stakes behind our questions. And that for me was a really pivotal essay for me, because it really makes me, at least every time I approach the question of research and what am I going to be doing in this paper or that paper or this book or that book, it really is about making sure that I ask questions that matter. And that was a piece that came out of this division and one of our own. And so that was something that was really pivotal for me.
And one thing I'd also like to add, too, is, and again, listening to the 9 panelists, is that it's wonderful to conduct research and to establish a line of research and to be known as a researcher. But if we think about it, perhaps one of our greatest contributions is taking what we've learned and then giving it back to our communities. I think about some of the in-service training I've done for one of our community colleges, and they wanted me to come in and talk about the role of teacher communication. So the first workshop I conducted was on teacher communicator style. Just talking about this line of research, and they were just floored. Didn't stop to think about the role that communication plays in the classroom. Second workshop I conducted was on student resistance, and again, it just was. They were just really surprised, and I think that is something that we all have the opportunity to do, regardless of what we do. In terms of, that sounds awful, but in terms of, in terms of convention papers or publications or things like that, is if you think about the practical aspect, or I'll call the outreach component, is using our research really to help others, help teachers become better. And by combining these perspectives, I think, for example, I think about the Power in the Classroom series that as a graduate student I was just completely... I don't want to sound too corny here because I was going to say enamored, but that might be too strong. I liked it. I thought it was pretty cool. But then I also remember reading Jo Sprague's articles, and that really got me thinking, well, power is wonderful, but what about all the injustices and inequalities that exist that maybe are inherent within that system? And so it just makes you think a little bit more about what you can do to become better at your own jobs. But again, more importantly, I think we have the opportunity to share this with other people, regardless of the situation, whether it's training, doing some in-service training for people on campus, non-profit groups, or just people that we know. The role of communication is vital in what we do. However we want people to learn, we have to understand, or let them understand, or let them figure out how important it is for you to be a good communicator for that to happen. Because especially when we teach, I teach in the off-campus program WVU with the teachers, and I teach a class called Communication and Affect and Instruction, and the same thing as Jim mentioned. There again, they say, why didn't we take this in our teacher ed program? This was the best class I've ever had. And it actually is good for me, because then they all like me, And so I get a little affect on the side there. And that sounds awful too, but because you know what I mean. All right, so we're going to move on, and we're going to ask our panelists to talk a little bit about the future of IDD. Where do we see ourselves going? I think we've had a good run so far, but there's got to be more out there. And what is it?
Well, I want to talk about a project that I'm starting to get off the ground at the University of Utah, working with the College of Education and my colleague, Mary Burbank, in the College of Education. The College of Education has turned their teacher licensure program into an institute for urban education. Yes, there is a need for urban education in Salt Lake City, Utah. There's a need for urban education in any major metropolitan area in this country. When in major metropolitan areas, we have 50% high school dropouts, maybe 70%. And so what this discipline in this area, ID can bring to the table is an understanding of how to bring cultures of support for success, access, and attainment to those environments. We can teach teachers and schools how to work with parents and communities to collaborate together to create a change, to change those dismal figures, to create vibrant schools that work well in neighborhoods, that create partnerships between neighborhoods and communities that feel disenfranchised by education. We can do that. This discipline and this division can bring our knowledge of collaboration and support to the table and help to turn those things around, and I'd like to see more of that going on.
And I'd just like to kind of go further from that, because one of the things I think that we need to spend more time doing is figuring out ways to share our findings with people other than ourselves. We spend lots of time talking to each other, and which is good. I mean, I like everybody and hear it. I want to talk to them. But people outside of communication, even outside of IDD in terms of other parts of our discipline, but when you get outside of the communication discipline, a lot of the things that we just kind of take for granted now at this point as being common sense ways of interacting in the classroom are not common sense ways at all for other disciplines. And they're frustrated with their teaching. They're being pushed to be more engaged teachers, to be better teachers, and they don't know what to do in many cases, or the things they think are the right things to do really aren't very effective, and that we really need to find ways, and I'm not sure what that best way is, if it's popular books, if it's workshops, if it's collaborative research. I'm not sure what the right way of doing that is, but we really need to figure out a way of sharing that, of what we know, with people at other disciplines at the college level as well as K through 12, but I think throughout any teacher.
And elsewhere. One of the most rewarding for me personally workshops that I've done recently was a workshop for administrative law judges in the state of Iowa. Their caseload, they have to complete 30 cases a week. 30 cases a week minimum. Sometimes it's more than that. Much of what they do is by telephone, and they're making life-altering kinds of decisions. There's an appeal process, but that's even longer. And there are times when the litigant can appeal to have an in-person kind of situation. So when I was asked to do the workshop, I was amazed at what I learned, because I never go into a workshop without doing my research and getting my homework done so that I know what I'm talking about. But the people afterwards would hardly let me get away because they hadn't thought about those things before, which was amazing to me. How do you make your living listening to people and resolving conflicts and not think about the ramifications of the way you approach things? So I think we need to get more opportunities to get into those kinds of situations.
One other area that I think is ripe for IDD people to work in, along with the K-12 people, is the national standards movement. You either are working with them personally or you're reading about them in the paper. And NCA recently endorsed the College Board standards that John Heineman and Sherry Morielli and I helped write, which are very strong, we feel, communication-based for the language arts standards. And the latest effort nationally is by the National Governors Association, along with the Council of Chief State Officers. I have a little handout on it if anybody's interested. They're coming out with national standards. And the people who are going to be implementing these standards really need our help. If we're going to argue, as we do, that they need to have a strong speaking and listening component to them, then one area that I think we should be supportive in is helping them be able to successfully fulfill those kind of standards. And just one little side point. When I was a reviewer, I did not write the standards, but as a reviewer, when I got the first draft to review, there were 4 standards for speaking and listening. There were 15 for writing and 17 for reading. As a result of the review process, we now have 8 for speaking and listening. Of the 25 I wrote, they picked a few and actually made some progress. But that's our story, isn't it? I mean, really, you've heard that different versions over and over. But we could really help, I think, if we could get them to recognize the role we could play, I think, in supporting that kind of movement.
I see a few things, or at least I want to see a few things. We'll see how that goes. To piggyback on that, I think we have a real opportunity to be involved in more advocacy efforts and more involvement in our communities, and I think we'll continue to see growth with respect to not just service learning, but redefining service learning so that it's a more mutually constitutive and beneficial kind of process. I also think we're going to see, related with that, or I would hope to see, a kind of a rebirth or a resurgence in studies that we would think of as communication education oriented. I think that over the last few decades we've seen a vision of a certain kind of research that counts as research. And I think that we've tried through scholarship of teaching and learning to try to take up what happens in our classrooms as research. And I think we'll see more and more of that as we continue to be increasingly interdisciplinary with respect to how we study the classroom. And I think the last thing I'd add to that is that I think we have an opportunity, and I think we're going to continue to see increasingly more sophisticated ways of understanding identity with respect to the classroom. And so that, in the ways that we are looking at race and gender, we're going to also be, exploring more deeply class and sexuality and disability, and in ways that understand people as at the intersections of different kinds of identity aspects that are meaningful and not necessarily just but traits, but something that interacts in a more substantive and nuanced way. And I think we'll see more of that too with more additional methods in our field.
My ideas they're I think quite a bit different. A lot of what we've been talking a lot about some of the cultural and social context of teaching and learning. I'm more interested, and I'm becoming more interested. I belong to a group called the Mind, Brain, and Education. It's a society at Harvard School of Education. And I get their journals, and they talk a lot about they are translating the cognitive neuroscientific research and its applications to educators. And their specific job is a translation arm to help educators understand how the brain works. And so I think it would be interesting. A lot of the work that has come out of the West Virginia model focused on affective learning, and the cognitive learning construct. It's still rather we don't know much about it, and our models it never really predicted much on cognitive learning. So I think it would be interesting for us to return to the ideas of cognitive learning and folding into some of the understandings coming out of cognitive neuroscience. For example, how the brain processes mathematical reasoning and processing is very different than when we're talking about reading and literacy related issues. And we're learning more about what's going on in the brain when these processes and these learning processes are occurring. Much has been written about the transfer of learning and the role of cognitive neuroscience in the transfer of learning and knowledge construction. And so I think it would be interesting very reductionistic, but I think it would be a piece of our puzzle, is to look at the impact of messages on the affective systems, the emotional systems in the brain, how they work simultaneously with more of the cognitive functions of the brain, and looking at how that impacts cognitive learning and seeing if we cannot develop models where instructional communication predicts cognitive learning, and by using cognitive neuroscience. So I think it's an interdisciplinary approach and folding in some of the work in cognitive neuroscience.
So I was having a conversation with my mother when she was in town the other day. Not to be too distracting here, but one of the things that was happening is we were trying to talk about the kind of current state of the economy, and one of the things that I was mentioning was that under a capitalist structure with competition at its base, we're necessarily pitted against each other. And my mother went, whoa, you're starting to make me feel all nervous about socialism. And I was like, wow, that was really fast for her to go immediately to like that kind of trope. And one of the things that occurred to me is the reminder that common sense and how common sense gets kind of structured into how it is that we think about certain kinds of things, like, for instance, capitalism or socialism, and the ways in which my mom was able to make those easy, quick links, is really kind of embedded in how it is that my mother and for me and for many other, for us all, the ways in which common sense gets constructed and kind of normalized. And that in order for systems of power to be in place, we really need to understand them on those kinds of mundane levels, and the ways in which, in order to have an institution that's powerful, like capitalism, it has to be embedded in our daily discourse. And so even the moment of calling out that little tiny thing, my mother immediately had all of these kinds of responses that were ready-made for her. And so that seems to me to be particularly instructive as we start to think about new movements in education. Specifically, some folks in education and critical pedagogy have been taking up questions about the body and performance, social justice education, specifically critiques of neoliberalism, globalization, and capitalism, and the ways in which those affect how it is that we teach, how it is that we learn, and how it is that we think. I think that one of the things that communication folks in particular are going to be good at is being able to call out those ways in which common sense gets located in our everyday talk. And it is our focus on everyday, mundane discourse that I think that we really can contribute and really be able to alter that conversation in ways that add levels of sophistication that is currently not present in that research. And that, for me, is really exciting, and I hope that folks take up that line.
Well, at this time, we are out of time. So I would like to thank again our panelists for their participation today, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to speak with them at the end of the presentation. So again, thank you all, and we appreciate your input.